The shape of time in medieval universal histories is very different from our own. To some extent, these differences are self-evident, particularly with regard to the use of a sequence of ages, from creation to the flood, from the flood to the life of Abraham, and so on, to impose numerical form on periods of time. We see this impulse toward periodization everywhere, from Orosius's 5th century World Chronicle on through the later medieval histories of Vincent of Beauvais and Ranulph Higden. Yet other features of medieval world histories are more subtle and repay formal analysis. Perhaps the most compelling of these are their visions of the future, which posit the fixed endpoint of apocalypse, but also make room for prophetic foreshadowing of events marking the end times. In other words, the present moment is a fixed point, as is the climactic end of days. Yet the moments in between these 2 points, these 2 fixed points, inhabit a temporal status that is purely referential, predicated extending forward from the present moment, as forecast astronomically by judicial astrology or philosophically in terms of future contingents, or predicted extending backward from the concluding moment of apocalypse, as signs of the last days. In order to fully understand pre-modern conceptions of the future and to situate these in the context of the conception of time found in medieval universal histories, it's necessary to come to terms with the fundamental role of return or repetition in narrations of the past. Universal histories posit a kind of temporal hinge marked by the incarnation of Christ, drawing upon the Pauline theory of supersession to organize salvation history into 2 halves. The period ruled by the dispensation of the so-called Old Law, narrated in the Old Testament, is fulfilled and superseded by the advent of the New Law of Christ, narrated in the New Testament. This typological mode of historiography was reflected in early medieval world chronicles and was immediately elaborated into parallel structures that grounded non-biblical figures in similar typological relations. For example, Orosius, writing in the 5th century, explicitly parallels Alexander the Great, who received the supplicant nations of the world in the remotest east, in Babylon, with his imperial successor, Augustus Caesar, who received the supplicant nations of the world in the most distant west, in Spain. Later historians, such as the author of the 13th century Histoire ancienne jusqu'à César, elaborate this Orosian schema still further, developing intricate, multi-age secular typologies that repeat the cycle of prefiguration and fulfillment multiple times, with type fulfilled in antitype upon antitype over several time periods. By examining some passages from influential world chronicles in the Orosian tradition, from the 5th century through the 14th centuries, and focusing especially on some 12th century examples, I'll try to give a sense of pre-modern ideas about the future. The 12th century examples that I'll focus on particularly include the Liber Floridus of Lambert of Saint-Omer, compiled early in the 12th century, around 1120, and the Historia de Duabus Civitatibus by Otto of Freising from the 1140s. In each of them, we can see clearly the foundational role of repetition in the writing of universal history. Otto opens his work by explicitly invoking multiple frameworks for the narration of time: Boethian, Orosian, and apocalyptic. These models share a commitment to a conception of future time that relies upon the interplay between duration, that is, movement between one point in time and a second point in time, and cycle, that is, the movement from one point in time through a circle that returns to the same point in time. By analyzing in formal terms the conception of time presented in pre-modern universal histories, it becomes possible to understand more fully the ways in which the linear time of modernity emerged from pre-modern ways of knowing, and to establish a clearer view of how medieval people perceived their own place in time. So I'll organize my remarks tonight in 3 parts, beginning with an overview of medieval ways of describing the possible future, both in individual and in collective terms. I'll then turn to the ways in which universal histories and world maps describe space in terms of time and vice versa, considering time as territory and the future as frontier. And then finally, I'll turn to the temporal hinge about which all of history is organized, sketching out how the nature of that turning point as both singular moment and as duration underpins medieval understandings of time more generally.